Well, thanks very much for being here today for this presentation. My name is Dan McInerney. I'm a professor in the Department of History at Utah State University. That university is in the city of Logan in the state of Utah in the western United States. And I've been at that institution since 1986. And I've been working on tuning since 2008-9 when this project was first introduced to the US. I want to thank everyone at the Tuning Academy so much for the opportunity to be here and to present some findings about a survey I've done with fellow historians. I'm looking at the way in which tuning has been presented through a disciplinary society in the United States. First, a bit of background about tuning in the US. Tuning came to the United States in 2008-9. And it came to a nation with a distinctive educational culture. We're not a centralized educational culture. It's highly decentralized. We have no national office that closely regulates higher education. The closest we come to this is the US Department of Education, but the work that they do in day-to-day university operations is comparatively limited. Most of what happens in the United States happens through state systems of higher education. And that's where Tuning USA began, in 3 state systems, one of them being Utah. The funding for all this did not come from public sources. It came, a kind of characteristic American feature, it came from private foundations. And the 2 that were most generous in sponsoring tuning were the Hewlett Foundation and especially the Lumina Foundation, which had extended tuning funding for the US. One question that these agencies faced in this decentralized system: how do you create a national system of outcomes-based, student-centered, discipline-focused projects in a society that is so radically decentralized into basically 50 different systems? The answer that these groups came up with was a unique experiment, the first time it had been tried in the world. And that was to work not through a state agency or any other political office or group, but through a national disciplinary society to organize tuning. And that came about in the year 2012, a few years after tuning began in the US. And the group that was picked for this work was the American Historical Association. This is a group that's based in Washington, D.C., approximately 13,000 members of this group. It's the world's largest professional disciplinary society of historians. And, well, it's convenient that historians are on almost every American campus because most students actually take a history course somewhere along the line, not as majors, but as students who take, for the most part, students take introductory history courses as part of another distinctive feature of American higher ed, general education. And looking at these characteristics, a large group, national in scale, quite prestigious, the most prestigious disciplinary society of historians, and this presence on almost every campus, it seemed to make sense for a project that was discipline-based. And the AHA has been extraordinarily active, especially through its executive director, James Grossman, in promoting tuning work, developing what has been called a discipline core. This is a kind of key set of reference points. What do we hope to achieve in historical study? What do we aim for in that work? We have organized scores of panels and presentations on tuning at large national meetings that usually get over 3,000 to 4,000 people in attendance, and also regional meetings. We've created what are called assignment workshops, where we gather faculty together to examine those most private documents, the exercises that faculty members give to their students, that in these workshops come before other faculty members who discuss the pros and cons of these assignments and their relation to larger learning outcomes. We've encouraged assessment efforts among historians, published scores of articles in leading journals on this project. The AHA has also built an extraordinarily rich website with information about tuning. And other related projects have developed within the American Historical Association, projects that are also tied to the nature of education, historical study, the opportunities open to students and to historians, not just in education, but in careers and civic life. And through the work of our executive director in particular, the James Grossman, we've also strongly encouraged tuning work in other disciplinary societies that exist on a national scale in the United States. And also, a very active agenda. The AHA has also been a prominent player with other national educational organizations that focus on teaching and learning issues. It's an extremely activist organization in this project. And with the faculty members who joined this project, the AHA opened up applications to colleagues in 2012 and in 2014 in two groups. We asked for people to apply with backing from their university. Everybody who applied was a volunteer. And those who were accepted into these cohorts of tuners were invited to attend special workshops that the society organized to engage in very close collaboration and conversation with one another about history and historical study, and then to bring the work back to their campus, to collaborate with their colleagues, to lead discussions about learning outcomes and the relation of learning outcomes to student learning, to set up discussion with so-called stakeholders, not just with other faculty members. The design of tuning, not only in the US, but of course in the EU in particular, was to extend these conversations outward, outside the academy itself, to business leaders, to political leaders, to community leaders, and then to assess the changes that have occurred. So two groups were brought in over a course of several years. And this is what the groups look like, or where they came from. There are a total of about 158 faculty from 122 campuses, and each dot on this map represents a campus in the United States that was represented in the tuning effort. Two different colors here representing the two different cohorts. So what do we know about the work of tuning since 2012? Well, we have a lot of grant reports from states and from regions and from the AHA itself, from these groups that have been sponsored by, especially the Lumina Foundation. We have to report back to them on what we've done with the funding that they've given us. We have reports about how the operations worked. The AHA also did surveys with the leading officers within the tuning project, and they did surveys with those 158 cohort members as well. But there's a gap. And the gap is with the general, everyday, rank and file faculty members throughout the United States. Those who weren't directly part of this work, who were hearing about it at second and third hand. And we didn't have much information about what difference this all made within courses and the design of a curriculum and in the activities of departments. And that's what my survey was meant to answer. What practical difference has tuning made in a disciplinary society since 2012? The survey itself, I composed this instrument. It has 42 questions in it. My estimated time of completion was 12 to 15 minutes. I emailed this to 1,500 different faculty members. And those faculty members were on the campuses that were part of the cohort groups. Remember, the cohort members were supposed to bring this message back to their campus. So I thought, let me see what happened on the campuses where these cohort members were from. And rather than doing 100% of them, I picked 70% of these campuses. But this was the response rate, 20%. That is not high. A consultant who's worked with the AHA has been very helpful to me and said, look, there are respectable studies that are done with that kind of response rate on emails, but we all acknowledge that's fairly low. And that's one of the key limits on this survey that I'd like to acknowledge from the very start. A second limit, I have no experience in this. This is my first major survey outside of departmental and college business. And the more I look at the results, the more I regret some of the wording I put in and the organization of it. I wish I had a chance to start all over again on this project. Unfortunately, too, there was a very small number of responses from two-year colleges. These are also distinctive institutions in the US that serve both vocational needs of some students and also serve as a kind of introduction to higher education. Students who go through these colleges often complete their gen ed requirements there and then come into a four-year institution. I wish I had more results from these colleges, and also from non-tenure track faculty. These are faculty who are not on some kind of fixed promotion system and whose jobs don't have all that much security. We all know that these surveys, they also focus on the perceptions of the respondents, not so much on hard, concrete facts, but on the way in which these people view the world. And one other point, I'm approaching all of this not simply as some kind of detached observer and researcher. I'm an engaged activist. I am very interested in the outcome of these surveys and the help that it can provide to the AHA, to the Lumina Foundation, and to the Tuning Academy as well. On the survey, I asked about just basic information about each participant, their department's work on tuning. I asked them about work on changes in their curricula and in their courses, the assessment of student learning at their institution. I asked about questions about enrollments. How many students do you have? Has that number changed? And just blunt questions. Are there benefits that you've seen in this project, and are there problems that you've seen? Tried to make the questions as direct as possible. So I want to go over some of these key results and offer some commentary on this too. And I'm going to focus the commentary the way any historian would look at evidence. What do historians pay attention to? They pay attention to change over time. We pay attention to causality, to the context of these events, to their complexity, the difficulty of interpreting these events, and also to matters of contingency. What happened didn't necessarily have to happen. So this is the approach I take towards this or any other kind of evidence that historians look at. On to the survey itself, finally. Who participated in it? I was very happy with one result. Most of the people who took the survey were not in the cohorts, meaning these were not people who had learned about tuning directly in AHA workshops. They had learned about it second or third hand. That was good news. Bad news. Only 20% of the respondents identified themselves as non-tenure track. The reason I'm concerned about this, the majority of instructors across the US are non-tenure track. Another disappointment, only 9% of the respondents were from two-year institutions. I was hoping for at least double that figure. It did not happen. One simple question to open after gathering information: has your department held discussions related to tuning? And 66% said yes, which looks like a good number until you remember something. These people are on campuses where there was a cohort member who was, and the purpose of the cohorts was to have people launch conversations about tuning. Perhaps that did happen in all cases, but a third of the respondents said no, they haven't had discussions about tuning. I asked this question many ways throughout the survey. And this was the range of answers I got in the negative, between 22 and 35% on different questions. So the numbers kept changing. I wonder how much of that has to do with the wording of questions. And also the level to which the participants understand the nature of tuning itself. But there's one other issue that I'll point to later. How well can participants isolate tuning as a discussion from many other teaching and learning projects that are going on at the same time? Who's led the discussions? Well, about 80% of respondents said that these were the groups that led the discussions on campus. No surprise here. The people from the cohorts, tenure track faculty, and department heads. Who took part in the discussions? More than 40% of the surveys said that these were the folks who were part of the discussions themselves. Cohort members, department heads, full-time faculty, and faculty with renewable contracts. What I could not help but notice was something else. In less than 20% of the responses, these groups were identified as participants, which is disappointing, because one of the things that tuning is supposed to do is open up a wide and inclusive conversation among educators and within a community. And it looked like from this survey that the conversations had not opened up that widely, that many key contributors to a useful discussion on tuning had not been included. What issues were commonly discussed in departments? This is half to 3/4 of the responses said that these were the issues that came up most commonly. And none of these should be a surprise to anyone engaged in tuning. These are some of the central questions that we look at with outcomes and assessment and the design of courses and the options that students have, the opportunities that open up to them. So this is good news that these were the discussions that were most common. They're all very critical, but I'd like to point out something. These kinds of discussions are not closely and tightly related to what goes on in classes day to day, in the meetings between faculty and students. More about that later. Which issues were rarely discussed? I received these responses in only 7 to 14% of the surveys. Meeting with stakeholders. Arranging meetings between faculty on 2- and 4-year campuses. Trying to understand what's going on each campus. Because this affects the transfer of students back and forth between these institutions. Improving the transfer of course credits. And focusing attention on non-majors in history. Those students who take 1 or 2 history courses. These issues were rarely discussed, but all of them are critical to the outreach that a tuning project can achieve. Was tuning connected with other types of projects in teaching and learning? I expected to see that this was, yes, indeed, there are many projects going on, and that is what the survey showed. Tuning is not isolated on campuses. Tuning is part and parcel of a large group of projects with different names, sponsored by different groups, all focused on outcomes-based, discipline-centered, faculty-led types of projects focused on teaching and learning. These are the most common projects that people reported on. A whole variety of projects in the US focused on learning outcomes. This surprised me. A large number who have taken up the work on rubrics for evaluating and assessing student work. And also this project, AHA Career Diversity. This is a project that grew up as the AHA considered what's happening to future faculty. How are they being trained? What are they learning about learning? And what are they learning about the skills they have outside of a position on a campus? because there aren't that many of those jobs available. Did tuning play either a central, a well-integrated, or a minor role in these discussions among many initiatives? Just about half of people said yes, it did. Which is, I take this as very good news. Was there little emphasis on tuning in these discussions? Only 13% said yes. Again, I take that as good news about tuning, that it takes a prominent place in these discussions about multiple initiatives. Quite a lot of data on the next few slides. And I just want to, I'll point out highlights here. What kind of changes did people report in the curricula at their institution? Here's one of the major ones. People said that in their curricula, there was far greater attention to identifying learning outcomes. 89% reported that this had happened in their department in history. Of those who reported that the change had happened, 56% said that tuning either had some or major influence in this work. All levels of influence, major influence, some influence, minor influence, connected with other projects, 74%. Emphasizing skills in historical research, another major change people pointed out. Was tuning as powerful a force here? No, but it still played a part in these discussions. The AHA Discipline Corps. I was surprised at this. 78% said there had been curriculum changes in their department geared to what the AHA had outlined as the core reference points in history. And not surprisingly, most people understood that this was centrally influenced by tuning. Now, I've put these 2 points in red. On the next few screens, watch how many reds appear. Clue? Not many. Mapping courses. Which courses fulfill learning outcomes? A lot going on. Tuning plays a role. Curriculum changes that emphasize the retention of students, completion of degrees, or equity issues, the fairness of higher education. Who's being allowed in? Who's succeeding in it? Again, a lot of change going on. Tuning is playing less of a role here. And pathways, showing students which courses lead to the most efficient route to a degree. Again, quite a lot going on, and tuning plays some role in this. Do you see any red on this? No, just on these 2 points. Changes in courses. Altering the structure of syllabi. Quite a bit going on, about 80% reporting this, and tuning plays a measurable role in these changes, according to the perceptions of the respondents. Altering the structure of intro courses, these general education courses. Again, a lot going on, tuning playing a reasonable role. Altering the evaluation of student exercise. I think this has a lot to do with rubrics. Once again, quite a few changes. The structure of capstone, the concluding classes for a major, most of which involve a major research project. And tuning playing a role here as well. Attention on the non-majors, wow, quite a bit less attention here with tuning. I would have thought it played a more important role for it. Again, you don't see any red here, indicating the highest degree of influence perceived by these respondents. And one final category here, teaching. Active teaching, de-emphasizing content, focusing more on historical skills, working with librarians, breaking away from the traditional lecture, working on research, and working on collaborative assignments. Again, a lot of changes going on. Is tuning at the center of these changes in the perception of faculty members? To a degree and to a varying degree. But again, you don't see any red. What do I take from all this? There are certainly changes Enormous changes that have been going on in the past 5 years in curricular courses and teaching. But tuning's influence seems to focus most prominently in curriculum design. And it has not yet reached a level of strong influence over courses and teaching. Quite a bit less influence there, at least in the perception of these respondents. Another category beyond curricular courses and teaching, assessment. How do we evaluate student learning itself? And this is pretty challenging. And this is where context comes in, because historians understand something about assessment, about the long-standing suspicion and skepticism among historians about assessment projects. And one of the best words on this comes from the person who heads our teaching division, Dr. Elizabeth Lehfeldt. She's a professor and a dean at Cleveland State University in Ohio. Her understanding of assessment issues, it's pretty blunt. You walk into a meeting of your average college or university history department and you utter the simple word assessment, the reactions will probably range from eye rolling to resigned sighs to blank stares, and some might even run screaming from the room. Assessment doesn't have a lot of fans among historians. Keep that in mind. What kind of change has occurred in the past 5 years? I think it's remarkable. What are the changes that respondents noted in assessment? Working with major research projects done by students. 81% report this. And 23% think that tuning has had some or a major influence on this decision. Half believe tuning has had some measure of influence on it. The other assessment changes, using rubrics to evaluate student exercises. And use of it, this surprised me the most, using assessment tools within course management systems. These systems are called Moodle, Blackboard, Canvas. There are other names for them. They are very complex systems that universities use to watch the movement of students in and out of courses and their work. But the tools themselves are not intuitive. It takes a lot of attention to work these assessment tools. And yet, 62%, 3/5 of respondents said they've been working with this. And that tuning has had some effect, kind of minor. But these are some of the assessment changes that have taken place. Next screen, a little quicker look at the assessment changes that respondents noted. Surveying alumni, having students take self-assessments of their work, using pre-tests and post-tests, and using exit interviews with graduate students. And you can see the level of perceived influence that tuning has had on these. What do I conclude from this? I look at this information. In one way, I gave the survey participants 15 different techniques to choose from. Only 5 of them were mentioned by a majority. So one way of looking at the results, that there are limits to assessment and assessment practice. The other way to look at it, what did we start with in our discipline? Hostility, skepticism, suspicion, and little use of assessment tools. There's been a considerable shift in practice. And a large number of historians believe that tuning and its related teaching and learning initiatives are responsible for this. Enrollments, this is a problem area. Most respondents said that enrollments in history courses are declining. And few believe that tuning has been of much help. The AHA had greater hopes for tuning. Number of history majors. Once again, story of decline. Did participants believe that tuning has been of help? Not many. Now, this is clearly something that the AHA has to come back and study again. Who's most comfortable with tuning? I was able to do some cross-tabulation in these responses. This is the group that tends to be most comfortable with tuning in its work and its projects. Tenure track faculty at both 2- and 4-year campuses who are members of the cohorts and who say they're fairly or quite knowledgeable about tuning. Who's most skeptical about tuning? It's this group. And this confirms anecdotal evidence that we've heard. The most common anecdote, the people who have been in the department the longest are just fixed in their ways, and it's very difficult to change them. We have some evidence for that. What did people request from the AHA? Most wanted the most popular, and these aren't in the majority of responses, the most popular request was for more information about a case study in tuning. How do you do it? A second practical question, how do we use tuning to increase enrollments? A third question, how do we give faculty members incentive to participate in their tenure and promotion procedures? And here's something that may come as a surprise to the AHA. There's still quite a demand for assistance at the introductory level, even after 5 years. The problems that were identified with tuning, and I'm looking at the most commonly mentioned, 2 issues were identified as major, minor, or modest problems. These are the 2. Over half of respondents felt that tuning was overemphasizing questions of careers at the expense of the intellectual depth of historical study. And over half believed something similar, that we're paying too little attention to historical content. This was a surprise. Now, for most of these people, they identified their concern as minor or modest. One way to look at this result, historians are a pretty contentious group. To have only 2 problems identified by a majority is actually good news. It's kind of strangely comforting. That's one way to look at this, but there's another way to look at it. And this is the one that concerns me the most, because these 2 issues have received such strong emphasis from the American Historical Association. It looks like we have a lot of opposition among our members about the positions that the AHA has staked out concerning these 2 issues. Benefits? Encouraging discussion, making implicit assumptions about history explicit, guiding the redesign of courses, clarifying our core reference points. Faculty are delighted about these activities within a tuning. Look, 60% identifying this as a major or modest benefit. And these are the benefits that the AHA has stressed. That's good. The aspirations of the AHA have been met, because these are the kinds of issues that AHA leaders have emphasized. "21 to 25% of respondents looking at these same issues stated that those very same points don't seem to be a part of the tuning project." This continues to puzzle me. Anyone familiar with tuning can understand that all of these are central to the work. Look at the percentage that don't even understand the relationship to tuning. Again, it suggests quite a lot of work that still needs to be done. To wrap this up, What are some of the continuing questions I have about this work? One of the key ones is measuring tuning's impact, focusing on that word itself. Because what I see evidence for are historians who are engaged in a wide series of initiatives focused on teaching and learning. And we've integrated these quite well. They're organically related to one another. It's easy to move from one of these projects to another because we're asking similar questions. That's good news. Maybe it fights initiative fatigue. But how do you distinguish tuning-related activities from tuning-caused activities? I don't know how to answer that question, and the survey hasn't helped me with this. But maybe it's not the critical question to ask. Because I posed this question to the Lumina Foundation back in 2010, telling them, you know, people are doing this work, but they're not calling it tuning. And the advice from the foundation that was providing our funding, focus on the changes in practice, not on the use of a brand name. What's changing in day-to-day work? That's what's important. And the survey shows considerable change in curricula, courses, teaching, and assessment. Still, about 30% indicated that their department is not working with tuning. I don't know what happened when some cohort members came back to their departments. A lot of this work is too inwardly focused. Tuning should direct us outside the academy. But most discussions were within a department. There wasn't much work with other campuses. There was limited engagement with stakeholders. And we're not drawing students into these discussions. This is troubling. There's also limited collaboration with non-tenure track faculty, this large group of faculty members throughout the US. And there are few incentives that were reported to engage faculty in tuning work. Hardly any success in dealing with enrollment drops. And continued skepticism by senior faculty. And a divided response on benefits. Remember that slide? People saying these are the great benefits of tuning, and then 21 to 25% saying, no, this has nothing to do with tuning. The successes, and I'd like to end on an optimistic note. There's very clearly engagement with these central themes in tuning. And the qualities of tuning that are most highly admired by historians are also the ones they are implementing. This is not just aspirational work. People are doing this work on the ground. There are very few strenuous objections to tuning. Look at this question. Should the AHA move away from outcomes-based initiatives or focus attention on other critical issues? Only 6% agreed. Again, if you know anything about the contentiousness of historians, you'd be very impressed by this low number. The biggest change, I think, has come in disciplinary culture. The day-to-day habits of historians, moving from an understanding of my course to our curriculum. The very private nature of teaching that we've rarely shared with one another, to collaborative work on teaching. An exclusive focus on content in history courses to a far greater concern with historical skills that we develop. An avoidance of assessment to understanding how much we as teachers can learn from assessment. A shift from instructor-centered work to student-centered work. A focus not just on how many hours a student is in a classroom seat, but on their performance within that seat and their exercises through careful evaluation. And a shift from a concentration on teaching to a broader concern with learning.